Good day, everyone, and welcome to The Literary Machine. I'm your host, K.O. Lin. If you're not familiar with this podcast, we analyze stories from pop culture and break down the story mechanics that either make the story or potentially break it. This week, I'm going to be doing a compare and contrast with the brand new Twisters movie to the 90s classic Twister. Before we jump into the podcast, I would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Links will be below. In my last podcast episode, I promised that the next episode would be about the 2023 sci-fi action-adventure, The Creator. I'm sorry, but that has now been pushed back to the next episode. I saw Twisters the other day after it came out, and given that it's so fresh, it seemed a natural thing to drop it ASAP. Before I even launch into the movies, though, I feel like a little bit of background is necessary. I'm from the Midwest, specifically Kansas. If you're not familiar, this lies solidly in the middle of the United States and also within the bounds of Tornado Alley. Although with the recent changes in climate, it's shifted a bit and created a second area called Dixie Alley, which generally hits the southeast United States, and that includes the states Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida. I lived in Kansas for about 12 years during the better part of my childhood. I have never seen a tornado. I've been in plenty of tornado watches, and my hometown has even been grazed by a tornado a few times. One time when I was away at college. My family still lives in Kansas, so I still head that way from time to time. However, regardless of ever experiencing a tornado, every Midwesterner who went to school in Tornado Alley will have had to go through tornado drills in school. We also learned roughly how a tornado formed. I'm not a scientist, obviously. I might have a better than average science education. Most of my scientific interests are in space, volcanoes, weather, and animals. I've watched a lot of documentaries. I'm not going to pretend like the documentaries have been that educational, but I am aware that the Fujita scale has since become the enhanced Fujita scale. The point I am trying to make is that I am pretty sure I know enough about tornadoes to spot when the movies either hand-wave explanations or engages in movie magic presenting unscientifically accurate tornadoes. Obviously, we're not here to tear apart the movies for anything unscientific. That is a job for someone else. But this podcast intends to explore the reasons for engaging in movie magic when reality just doesn't cut it. Because there can be legitimate reasons to play fast and loose with reality. See the entire Chernobyl miniseries. But literally also go see it, because Chernobyl is a masterpiece of cinematic storytelling, and that cannot be understated. It was fantastic. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to do a podcast on Chernobyl, especially since the writer, Craig Mazin, has already done a podcast on writing it. This is your cue to look that up. Anyway, I'm going to stop gushing about what a flawless masterpiece Chernobyl is, even though some might argue that Chernobyl is guilty of simplifying everything to the max. While Chernobyl does a decent job of suggesting the magnitude of the disaster, in some ways it fails to exemplify it because hundreds of people were involved. And I'm not talking about the miners or even the volunteer people who attempted to decontaminate the region. I'm talking about the fact that they boiled down hundreds of government officials and scientists to just 3 main people, one of whom is entirely fictional. The situation is severely condensed. It cut corners, but I think many would agree it got some of the more important points right, if not the broader picture. And I'm going to end that here because I don't know enough about the historical situation to render a finer judgment on the matter. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move on to the summary of these movies. For anyone who hasn't seen either of these two movies and want a spoiler-free experience, this is a spoiler emergency alert. Please seek shelter to avoid spoilers. This is not a drill. You will want to seek shelter immediately. Now let's go. First, I want to make a point here. People are calling Twisters a sequel to Twister, and I'm not sure I agree with that. It has a few Easter eggs to the original movie, a couple of nods and winks, but truly about the only connection it has to the original is the tornadoes themselves. I'd call this more of a reboot than a sequel, in my personal opinion. Despite that, they do have nearly the exact same premise. Both feature two groups of storm chasers. In the first, the main characters want to revolutionize warning systems to make people safer. In the second, the main characters want to use a type of chemical deployment that will stop tornado formation in its tracks, thereby saving lives. There is also an, quote, evil, unquote, team of storm chasers of sorts, but the true villain and star are the Twisters themselves. The situation in Twisters is a bit more loosey-goosey in that a majority of the characters are in varying shades of gray. Like, the main character, Kate, is with a team of scientists going up against a bunch of YouTube yahoos doing crazy crap for views. But by the end, Kate's running with the group of yahoos because they're more serious about helping people, whereas her former scientist crew was more serious about helping their investors make money. Both also immediately start with a tragic event. Jo loses her father, and Kate loses her three best friends and tornado-chasing comrades. It does affect each of their characters differently. Jo's loss of her dad encourages her to chase tornadoes to improve warning systems. By contrast, Kate was testing a theory to disrupt a tornado, but the tornado ended up being more than she and her friends bargained for. This event takes Kate out of the field, and the next time we see her, she's working for the National Weather Service in New York City, of all places. One of the connecting tissues between the two movies is this idea of someone having uncanny instinct for storms and tornadoes. In Twister, it was Bill, and in Twisters, it's Kate. Right from the start, I was so certain they were going to set up Kate as being Bill and Jo's daughter. But they decide to sidestep that trope and make it so that the entirety of the cast doesn't have any connecting tissue to anyone from the original cast, as far as I can tell. Nothing wrong with that, just evidence that this is more of a reboot rather than a sequel. I was so certain that part of Kate's character development would be that she no longer trusts her instincts like she used to, since she could be blaming her prediction for getting her friends killed. That may have had a tiny effect, but the angle they take with Kate is that she loses faith in her theory because the experiment didn't work. The better part of the movie is spent building her back up into having confidence in her theory. I'm going to admit some bias here. I didn't particularly like the first Twister when I first saw it. It's grown on me enough to be a comfort watch, but certain aspects of it just rub me the wrong way. I don't like the main character, Bill. The first extended, quote, private, unquote, conversation we see between Bill and Jo, Bill just sounds like an angry blowhard. So much so, he's not paying attention to the road and nearly runs into a tractor. Was Jo being unfair in the discussion? Maybe, maybe not, but he really did bite her head off, as she said. He softened a little bit over the course of the movie, but not really enough to make me like him. Jo herself was, well, fine. She's energetic, passionate about tornadoes, but she's still a bit flat. After all, what is her character arc throughout the movie? The movie's romantic side plot focuses on her and Bill's relationship, but we see in the beginning she changes her wedding ring from one finger to another to hide the fact that she still loves Bill. So, the movie is more about Bill falling back into her orbit more than it has anything to do with her developing character. Her motivation doesn't change either. In the beginning of the movie, her dad loses his life to an F5 tornado. I can't even say she eases up on her obsession about deploying Dorothy because they're working to deploy Dorothy throughout the ending of the film. So Jo's just kind of there to be a romantic lead and add some flavor in terms of her personality. The tornado graphics weren't bad per se, but the sound design? Tornadoes don't growl. I know they were taking liberties and attempting to cast the tornado as more of a monster than a weather event, but it just causes a weird dissonance. A non-living entity growling? I'm happy to say the tornadoes don't growl in the second movie. The first movie's plot progression was also set up like a video game. With every Twister encounter, the Twisters get stronger and stronger until the team comes up against the final boss, the F5 Twister, where they can't defeat it, but they do complete their objective. Then at the end, we see Bill and Jo running from this mild-wide Twister. One of the rule of thumbs around tornadoes is that you never try to outrun it in your car. And these two outran it on foot. Then they anchor themselves to the ground, but there's no protection from the storm at all. They just left a barn full of the most horrific stabbing tools imaginable, but the tornado just leaves them unscathed. I have heard tornadoes leaving things miraculously untouched, but this is too much for my personal suspense of disbelief. Furthermore, Jonas and his crew were underdeveloped. What is the worst that Jonas did to our heroes? As far as I can tell, he only stole Bill's idea for his sensor deployer. That's very bad. As a creative, intellectual property is very important to me, but otherwise, Jonas's threat as a villain really doesn't amount to much. He doesn't help them after Jo's truck is destroyed, but that makes him inconsiderate more than evil. And honestly, would Jo even want his help? I think they could have done more to elevate Jonas's sinister nature by perhaps deliberately sabotaging the gang, but it clearly wasn't a priority for the story. I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, what did you like about the original Twister movie? As a whole, I enjoy the cast. I'm personally an introvert, so I don't know that I'd want to hang out with these people, but they were quirky and fun. I did enjoy their dynamic with each other. Easily one of the best parts of the movie. I also like that Bill's fiancée, Melissa, wasn't cast in the light of a villain. They could have easily made her a person who gets aggressive over another woman encroaching on her man. But she doesn't. I question her actually being able to hear Bill and Jo having their argument over the radio when they're about 30 feet away from it, but she took the changes in her life gracefully. I can admire that she was totally out of her depth, but was willing to jump in feet first before realizing this tornado chasing was incompatible with her lifestyle. For the highest entertainment value, they could have easily made Melissa an awful person. But they resisted that, and decided that the framing of the movie should center more on the tornadoes than on the romance. And I can dig that decision. Besides that, the reason why I continue to rewatch the original Twister is simply because it's an action-adventure movie. When I look back on the 90s, all of my favorite movies were some manner of action-adventure. Die Hard with a Vengeance, Tremors, The Fugitive, Twister, Sleepy Hollow, Aladdin, The Lion King, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, Aliens, Predator. Okay, the last two are 80s films. Still, to this day, action-adventure remains my favorite genre, and it wasn't until I saw Twisters that I realized how much I missed action-adventure movies. It doesn't really feel like Hollywood has come out with many. I could also just be missing them. Twisters, being an action-adventure movie, is easily the main point that I liked most about it. It was fun. It was entertaining. It was, arguably, more grounded in reality than the original movie. but it still had ostentation aspects that I would take with a grain of salt. None of this ruins the story, but if you like Twister, you know what to expect. For instance, I think Kate's theory for destabilizing tornadoes by sucking up the moisture in a storm is entirely plausible. Is it practical? Doubt. But I'm not Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't care that much if it's scientifically accurate enough. That it sounded plausible is generally enough for me. The acting in Twisters is pretty good, with a decent script that had a little bit of nuance. As I said, Kate started with one group of storm chasers, who were the serious business type, and then ended up with the YouTube yahoos, because while they may be bombastic and annoying, they're the heart of gold types. If there is one thing that the original Twister did better than the new one, is that they made time in the narrative to allow the supporting cast to shine a bit, show their abilities, develop their camaraderie, etc. While each of the YouTube yahoos were pretty distinct, the focus of the second movie was on Kate and Tyler's relationship. Which is kind of funny, because while clearly the movie was setting up the romantic angle between Kate and Tyler, they don't even kiss before the movie ends. In the last few moments of the movie, Tyler clearly approaches Kate with romantic intentions, but then they just turn and walk away together. Given the incredibly obvious romantic overtones, they still resisted showing any real romance. It's up to the audience if they can take it or leave it. Much like the original cast and the evil Jonas Storm Chaser, Kate's business-type group Storm Chasers and the YouTube Yahoos have a competitive setup. They meet right at the start in a rural gas station area where everyone's just waiting for the storms to build enough for the tornadoes to start forming. Kate catches Tyler's eye immediately, and he walks over to engage her in conversation, asking her opinion on the storm cell buildups. So often with female protagonists, they're written to be a bit woefully naive. I was watching this first exchange between Kate and Tyler and silently pleading, "He's just trying to get information from you. Don't fall for it. Don't give up the trade secrets." And Kate does at least attempt to lead Tyler off onto a wild goose chase. However, he equally susses out her intentions, and Tyler and his crew end up sealing the initial thunder. Either way, it was refreshing to me that although Kate was young, she wasn't so naive not to see Tyler's intentions from a mile away. So, yay for smart female characters. There's one scene about halfway through the movie that I thought was an interesting callback to the beginning of the film. As I've already mentioned, the film opened with 3 of Kate's friends dying in a tornado, and it's heavily implied that one of those friends was her boyfriend. They hide under highway overpasses, which is a terrible idea. The movie itself calls it out as a bad idea. At the beginning, Kate and her boyfriend are huddled up under the overpass. She's holding on to some sort of piping, and he's lying over her, constantly saying things like, "I've got you, I'm not going to let you go," stuff to that effect, and then the tornado rips him away. In the middle of the movie, Tyler and Kate have bonding time at a rodeo away from the other cast, and then a nighttime tornado shows up. They seek shelter and pull a mother and her daughter with them. Tyler is hovering over Kate in a similar manner to her old boyfriend, but it's the mother that keeps a steady refrain in platitudes. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the mother had the exact same script as Kate's old boyfriend, bringing us back to the beginning of the movie when Kate nearly lost everything. In this situation, they're in an arguably safer place, but everyone who was with her for that made it out alive. During this sequence of events, the camera was slowly zooming in on Kate, enhancing the mother's audio in the background. I was so certain the film was going to cut to a flashback of the beginning of the movie. A not uncommon narrative move. But it didn't. A slight subverting of expectations. Kate's trauma from losing her boyfriend and 2 friends has hardly been subtext. She took an office job in New York City. When her friend Javi comes to recruit her for his business, She's hesitant and can barely meet his eyes. Afterward, there's a scene of her sleeping in bed, and then her boyfriend takes her in his arms and she starts awake. When she and Javi chase their first tornado, Kate panics and drives them away before they can complete the mission. The beginning had heavy emphasis on her trauma. However, after the first tornado caused her to panic, she apparently gets a grip on herself, and she's able to continue chasing tornadoes without too much trouble. It's not until the middle of the movie, when she, Tyler, and that mother and daughter wait out a tornado, that her trauma really returns. Now, some could argue, quite cynically, that her trauma conveniently disappears and reappears when the plot demands it. They might also suggest that the film was better served if they didn't try to shoehorn in a plot point that it didn't have the bandwidth to explore. Unless a story specifically zeroes in on exploring the trauma of the situation, making it center stage, it is really difficult to give that kind of trauma the space it needs to play out naturally in film of any sort. In that case, one might argue that perhaps the inciting incident should then be changed if the film doesn't have the appropriate amount of space to address the trauma. But if you do that, then you're walking away from the tried and true formula that made the original Twister a classic. I imagine at some point in every single storytelling self-help, this is going to be addressed, and I won't make the literary machine an exception. We use formulas, cliches, and tropes because they work. To use them is to not be lazy, but to understand that there are some aspects of storytelling that are difficult, if not impossible, to get away from and get an equally good story out of it. Sometimes cliches can be bent, broken, turned on their heads, but it's not possible to do this with every single cliche and come out with a story that's pleasing to an audience. It's important not to become so complacent as to lean on cliches like a crutch, because that can then make storytelling a tad stale. But it's equally important to know when to apply one and when to not. All stories, to a greater extent, are a series of variables that are both familiar and unfamiliar, and sometimes storytelling feels a bit like throwing these things into a blender or a tornado and then seeing where they fall. I'm not so cynical about this aspect of storytelling. I think they implemented the trauma as naturally as they could. Trauma can be a little strange, and it's hardly straightforward. It can come and go. The fact that Kate's trauma interrupted the first tornado chase is a point in the plot's favor. She's not some superwoman who just brushes her fears away. She does struggle with them. After she failed her friend, Javi, that one time, she works hard to get a grip on her nerves and try again for his sake. Not the healthiest coping mechanism, but characteristically plausible. It's clear to me that the filmmakers decided to front-load Kate's trauma in the beginning of the movie so that later, when the YouTube yahoos come in, they can then shift their focus to giving those characters the necessary screen time to familiarize themselves with the audience and also carve out the space for Kate and Tyler to develop their relationship. By the time the trauma comes back in the middle of the movie, Kate and Tyler are on good enough terms to begin working on her theory from the beginning of the movie, which then leads us back nicely into the climax of the film where they have the encounter with the EF5 tornado. The actual tornado scenes in both movies were, on the whole, well executed and appropriately intense. The noise level was high, and the danger the characters were in felt very real. Realistic? For Twister? No. For Twisters? Yeah-ish. I do think the Twister's cast had its own fair amount of plot armor, especially since the shtick of the YouTube yahoos is to literally drive straight into the Twister and anchor down using drills to keep them from getting picked up. I distinctly remember some time ago that storm teachers attempted the same thing in an armored vehicle. I do mean armor that was essentially covering a vehicle like scale mail, and then the car was lowered to the ground so that the Twister's winds couldn't get underneath. Now, That survived. Whether Tyler's truck and twisters would have survived? Hard to say. Tyler does say it's heavily modified to be heavier, and I'm sure the glass is thicker on the windshield, but there was no mechanism to lower it so that the winds couldn't get underneath it. Perhaps the key to Tyler and his crew's success was that they know better than to attempt it with a really dangerous tornado. They can't, really. After all, that's what got Kate and her original group of friends in trouble. Tornadoes are evaluated for their intensity after the fact. The truth is, it's probably not the wind that they would have had to worry about, but the debris. In the movie, they go into a twister that's going through a field with little in the way of debris besides dirt. It might be plausible. That said, plausibility was stretched pretty much to the breaking point with the last tornado sequence. It was, of course, an EF5, and this sequence was extended, intense, and a little bit ridiculous. Everyone in their cars is right next to the tornado when it hits an oil refinery, and that probably should have been the end of them all. Then they race into town to get everyone into shelter. Remember how I said outrunning a tornado is a bad idea because it'll catch you? They successfully outran this tornado and got into town a good 10 minutes or so before it hit. Much more happens that tests our heroes' plot armor. I'm sure some will find it unbelievable and others won't care. If you're curious where I fell, I was too caught up in the moment to honestly care. Though I did definitely expect Kate to die and left the sequence feeling similar to how Bill and Joe survived their F5 twister encounter. It's whatever. After all, a movie like this is for spectacle. It did care a little bit about the science, but what it cared more about was the spectacle. And there's nothing wrong with that. If a high art masterpiece movie is considered fine dining, then Twisters is the fast food equivalent in the film world. You can't have fine dining all the time or it'll become stale. Fast food films whet a certain appetite and usually leave the audience in higher spirits than where they started. The same can be said for the original Twister. It's a comfort watch, precisely because it's fast food. We're here primarily to be entertained, after all. This podcast isn't for analyzing the literary merit of a story, but deconstructing its storytelling mechanisms to reveal its inner workings and thereby learn how to craft a better story. While Twister may not have been wholly successful for me personally, it was successful on the whole and has since reached cult status for a wider audience. More people remember the film fondly than don't. I think it's possible the same will happen to Twisters because, while it's different enough to be unique, it still uses the same approach as the original film, and that works in its favor. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice. As previously mentioned, the sci-fi film, The Creator, is the next episode on the docket, so subscribe to be notified of that. Until next time, this is K.O. Lynn, signing out.